Today, our world has become so filled with such technological advances that societies 10,000 years ago could not even imagine our progress. So why is it that our society has adapted from everyone hunting and gathering to a world that depends so heavily on the agricultural industry? To find the answer to this question, we must take into consideration prehistory. In the early years, before the Neolithic Revolution, people had hunter-gatherer lifestyles and followed the pattern of resources in order to acquire their meals. Archaeology tells us that agriculture changed for the world when the last ice age hit, which was approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The animals and plants man used for food began to die off, and the people of the Neolithic age realized that this type of mobile lifestyle could not sustain them any longer. After the end of the Ice Age, the weather became warmer and man adapted to the food resources which were readily available. People started to change their nomadic lifestyles and began to live with one another while domesticating both plants and animals, and using their knowledge of hunting and gathering. Eventually, they began to combine their farming techniques with foraging. Places in the Middle East, like the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, including parts of Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, played an immense part in the slow birth of agriculture. These areas had rich farming soil, as well as an abundance of edible plants and animals, including easily domesticated cattle. There is a small village in the Jordan River Valley near Jericho named Drah, which is thought to be the world's first known farming village. While some archaeologists believe that other areas may have been the starting point for the domestication of plants, studies on Drah produced early evidence of barley cultivation. During the Neolithic Revolution, people learned how to control fire for heat and light and learned how to make more foods edible, which resulted in the expansion of their dietary selection. Soon after the discovery of fire, mankind learned how to extract metals from rocks by using the smelting process. This is why the late Neolithic age was dubbed the Bronze Age. This advancement provided more reliable tools such as flint points, axes, spears, and the bow and arrow, which later led to hunting societies. Humans learned that if they hunted together, they would be more successful. Another of the inventions made by humans during the Neolithic Revolution was the wheel. The discovery and invention of the wheel helped to start a mechanical and transportation innovation. It helped to make the production of food easier. Civilizations began to spread across the globe. Societies in the Middle East, northern China, and Mesoamerica thrived. This was not because they were more advanced than others. It was mostly because they had geographic luck on their side, which plays a major role in how well a civilization thrives. Society, economics, and environment are the pillars of sustainability. If one of these pillars is not stable, then it is nearly impossible for a civilization to thrive for an extended amount of time. If you look back at the Norse of Greenland, they lived in a harsh environment that contributed to the limitation of their resources. Due to an imbalance in their pillars of sustainability, the civilization died out by the mid-1400s. The Norse brought cows, sheep, goats, and pigs to Greenland. The animals required shelter and feed during the harsh weather just to keep them alive. The cows and pigs found the weather too cold to survive, so sheep and goats became their staple animal, which were some of the first domesticated animals. Even the sheep and goats required the Norse to grow food for them and keep them sheltered. Crops were limited to the small amount of cabbage and barley, while other crops could not grow. Other food and non-food stuffs had to be traded as cargo. The Norse filled their boats with walrus tusks and bear hides and traded with northern Europe. The colder temperatures increased ice cover, limited transportation, and reduced their ability to trade. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the mid-1800s, the Greenland Norse had completely died out. For a civilization to grow, they have to farm, and if they have better farming resources than other areas, they are going to survive better and increase their population because it will be easier to farm without working as hard. Helpful resources for farming would be rich soil, temperate weather, natural pastures for animals, and easy access to water. These types of resources are what make certain regions more geographically fortunate. Pastoral farmers domesticated only 14 species of animals, and before the Industrial Revolution, animals were the strongest power source for farming. Domesticated animals need to get along with humans, be docile as well as social, willing to live in herds, and be at least 100 pounds so that they can be hooked up to machinery. The animal's growth rate and thrifty development also helped identify which animals would be selected. The animals that met the criteria were goats, sheep, pigs, cows, horses, donkeys, Arabian camels, Bactrian camels, water buffalo, reindeer, llamas, yaks, mithons, and Bowery cattle. People in more geographically fortunate regions most likely had animals living around that could be domesticated and used for labor. Animals are important to farming because they can eat leftover crops and can also help fertilize the fields. In history, farmers and herders generally lived in separate environments. The agrarian farmers preferred well-watered lands, while the pastoral farmers seemed to dominate more arid regions. But there has always been a zone in between which has been the site of ongoing competition. The rise of the Roman and Chinese empires brought agrarian civilizations to the top, but German tribes and Mongol hordes invaded the empires and reclaimed pastures from the plow. Invasions may have caused cultural conflicts, but it also helped with the diffusion of various diets and foods. As trade between civilizations developed and food supplies became more secure, the wealthy people defined new forms of exclusion based on refinement in food and diet. The wealthy could afford more exotic, imported agricultural products and have them imported into their meals. Poorer people could not afford to eat the same diet as the rich. Even today, in our diet-conscious contemporary world, obesity is correlated with the lower class status. Types of food and preparation continue to be the outcome of class distinction. Throughout history, there was allocation. In the beginning, men were allocated more food than women and children because they needed more energy to gather and hunt. As the years went on, people were allocated food depending on how much money they had, and this practice continues in modern-day society. With the travels of various sailors from different civilizations, there was an enhanced time of food and diet diffusion. As Christopher Columbus made trips to and from the New World, highly productive crops were introduced to Europe and other countries. Disease was also exchanged, and the grain and livestock transfers had a great influence on modern diets. The exchange of disease caused demographic shockwaves in both hemispheres. The pace of social and dietary change accelerated in the 19th century. The agricultural rewards of the Columbian Exchange were substantial. The introduction of corn to Europe and the rest of the world, as well as tubers, along with other spices and legumes, provided foods which helped a growing world feed itself. The New World had very little livestock. In fact, one of the big agricultural differences between Native Americans and European subsistence cycle was the use of animals and plants. The Europeans sought a total year-round control over their animals' lives and crops. The Native Americans maintained a close relationship to deer, moose, and other animals they hunted. They also made use of native plants in harmony with the seasons. When the Europeans began to farm in New England, the whole landscape began to change. Within 100 years of their arrival, the land had been overfarmed and the entire countryside was changed again. During the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution began. People started creating new technology and began large-scale farming to feed the world's growing population. This agricultural revolution was triggered a great deal by the Columbian Exchange and the exchange of foods and diets. The industrialized farm needed intense labor before machines were invented, and thus along came the slave trade. As machinery was developed, slave trade diminished. There was a new demand for cheap labor, and it was met by a new class of people, the industrial workers. The workers either had small paychecks, or there was a system of shared cropping developed. Either way, the industrial workers was in a lower class compared to the owner of the factory and other individuals. Machines are now used to harvest crops, instead of using human labor. Chemical fertilizers also became popular during the Industrial Revolution because people found that, when they put nitrogen on crops like corn, the plants grew faster. This was the beginning of an industrialized and centralized society. During the times of the Industrial Revolution, large-scale farms were born. People started to rely on these farms for more of their dietary needs because they could produce food at a faster rate than small-scale farms. During the late 1800s, the American Great Plains were made available for homesteading. The Industrial Revolution had also provided technology to open the expensive flat lands of Great Plains to farmers. Windmills helped provide water, steel plows broke the hard ground, and various horse-drawn farming equipment made it possible for sodbusters to farm on the Great Plains. Ranching and cattle prospered on the plains because of the vast area of grassland called an open range. The open range provided free, unrestricted grazing for herds of cattle. Cowboys used to drive their herds to the nearest railroad stockyard, where they would be sold and shipped by train. But things did not bode well for farming the American prairie. Prairie soil could completely blow away during the dry season, and many sodbusters lost their farms through the combined effects of drought, wind, erosion, and the overuse of land. Great Plains farming was once called bonanza farming, where wheat fields covered up to 50,000 acres. A severe drought in the late 1880s virtually demolished the wheat belt. Many farmers lost their land and ended up working as tenant farmers and renting from their new owners. The real story of the West was not about bonanza farms. It was about the real people settling down. The idea of large-scale agriculture continued into the 20th and 21st century, when people began to mostly rely on these large-scale farms to produce our food, because it helped to support the growing population, despite the impact of the community or the environment. Things have drastically changed since the time of hunting and gathering, but without those ancient civilizations that first developed stone tools and domesticated animals, our society would not be alive today. Their civilizations created a basis for our own. Those early human societies, with their use of fire, domestication of animals, and geographic luck, made them capable of farming lands that became building blocks, and they are the reason that we came from a society that struggled to survive by hunting and gathering, to a place with advanced technologies and more geographic luck than we could imagine.